Nope.
Dan, my man, welcoming us with a bell. It's nice.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just gonna turn off my just turn off this so it don't get the annoying bells. Who needs that? There you go. Sweet. Good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. Last time we spoke, I think it was you were either the first or second person I had on the podcast. Pretty sporadic through last year, but being very consistent now. And your podcast was easily one of the most popular.
Oh wow.
And yeah, and
That's good.
I think people are really interested in the various things that you do, and particularly last time we talked a lot about mixed fueling and how that's tailored towards your endurance activities and things. But since then, you've been up to a bunch of things. So what have you been up to since we last spoke?
When did we last speak? That's the first question.
You had just done Topor, and I think you were gearing up to go off to Kona.
Yeah. Okay. So Taupo was done and dusted, and then last year, 2018, was the biggest thing. I guess last year was I had the arrival of a little girl, but she was the biggest thing. That she was the biggest part of my life last year was seeing her grow up. But I guess on the professional side, I went to the Ironman World Championships in Kona. Had a big bit of prep going into that, and I had a pretty good race there. Won the age group competition overall. Broke the age group course record by more than 10 minutes. So yeah, that was kind of my 2018 summed up. Pretty big year in terms of triathlon, and since then, training's gone. Not doing so much training now. I decided not to race in 2019. I'm just taking a bit of a hiatus and concentrating on new business and work really. So doing a few things there.
So that Kona, I mean, Topol as well, but that Kona race for you was, I mean, I don't know what it was like for you, but from the outside looking in, it looked like it was massive. And I know that a lot of people knew about you beforehand, but now when I talk to endurance coaches, endurance athletes, and you mention Dan Plews, we're like, oh, that they know immediately. So, I mean, you've become a bit of a rock star in the space. How has that changed things for you?
Yeah, it's funny, like, because I feel I've done a reasonable amount of stuff in at least the sports science and the coaching world. I've a few publications and coached a few top athletes, been to Olympics, but it was kind of that it was my own performance that put me on the map a little bit. So yeah, and it's been really good, just from trying to make the most out of it really. And I think I've been beating the same drum for a while, like in terms of low carb performance, in terms of HRV training, monitoring, whatever it might be. But like it's given me a bit more of a platform to speak from, which has been quite nice.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably, I mean, I don't know if you agree, but it was probably the way in which you did it. I mean, the amount by which you smashed that record, and also, I guess, culminating in the growth of low carb and keto and things like that now, being seen as an LCHF athlete and then going out and smashing a record like that. Do you think that has a role to play in how much people have picked up on this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It kind of gives support, especially to the naysayers who think it can't be done. Like, people just don't understand a lot of the time. And it still baffles me to this, even now when I talk to people about it and they go, they say, oh, you need carbohydrates to perform. And like, yeah, okay. But, you're thinking of it, people thinking of it in the wrong way. And I think that was finally the time where people actually, saw that I could, you can have the best of both worlds. You can have what I like to think of what the new company Endure IQ, what we like to say is performance, health, and enjoyment. I think you can have all three, and people think you can't. You have to. If you're performing on one side, you have to take your health off on the other side, and I don't think that's really the case. So yeah, so I think. I think that was what was really pushed forward. So that's good.
So, what do you say to the naysayers? Because there's going to be people who take a sort of either a contrary approach or a devil's advocate approach, where they say, well, you did great in this race and the Topol preceding it, but either maybe it was in spite of your diet, or perhaps you would have done better eating more carbohydrate. What do you say to that sort of position?
Yeah, well, I'm under no illusion that I'm not going to sit here and say that diet was 100% the whole thing. Of course, it was a contribution of training and diet and the whole thing pulled together. But I think what I did better than anyone else is I merged them together, whereas most people can't do that because they don't really have the understanding to be able to merge both training and a diet that is lower in carb. But I think like on that side, I've been doing triathlon since I was 9 years old, and I've never really progressed in the way I have. And I've always known training. I've always been a physiologist. And I would say the main change in what I've done since 2012, where my kind of steady progression to Kona in 2018, is to change my diet. And I've not just changed my diet, I've refined and progressed my diet in such a way that is optimal for training and for long distance triathlon.
So when you say you melded the training and the nutrition, and maybe a lot of people don't do that so well, what does that involve? How do you meld sort of lower carb or carb appropriate type nutrition with your training?
One major thing that I do is I've never restricted protein. I think that's a massive mistake that anyone going into this space of low carbohydrate diets, especially when they're athletes, they read up on the studies, and most of the studies are done in epilepsy. So, and all the protein requirements are based on treating epilepsy, and people go around trying to reduce carbohydrate, trying to think of this trying to not have too much gluconeogenesis. And that, I think, is the biggest mistake most people make. I mean, gluconeogenesis, people don't realize that it's not a supply demand thing. It's not like you don't have more and more, you don't eat more and more protein and you have more and more gluconeogenesis. Your body will go into homeostasis, and it will set a point where it thinks is right for your amount of gluconeogenesis that's taken place. So that's one thing. I also I started off quite low in the carb, and I gradually brought it up to a level that I felt was good for me, and that was around 120 to 100, around 120 grams per day. So you're not talking ketogenic; you're talking more low carbohydrate, and the term ketogenic, I think, is just a misunderstood term, because ketogenesis is not necessarily a diet. It's a physiological state, right? It's not a diet per se. So even as athletes, you can be in ketosis by exercising, like exercise-induced ketosis, and still be just in a lower carb state. So you kind of get the benefits of both. Like I find that people generally push that low carb too much. And the next is targeted sessions. So when introducing carbs and when taking them away. So if you have got that kind of 120 window, where are you going to put those in? When are you going to have them in your day? If you're going to have a high intensity session, put them in before that. If you're going to have a low intensity session, put them in after that. So they're those sorts of things that I think I really refined along the way that really worked for me.
Yeah, I spoke about that with Grant on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, Grant Schofield, and he agreed. Actually, it was one of the biggest take homes that a lot of people took out of that podcast. Was he agreed that protein is really important. A lot of people in low carb have really been too hard on protein for the reasons you say, and he was saying they're going to change that when they re-release What the Fat. The book that he and Karen did, because they talked quite a lot about gluconeogenesis. And I guess from my point of view, I've always, and I think this is based on the evidence, I've always had that idea that gluconeogenesis is demand driven, not supply driven. And so, your body will, like you say, it will produce the amount of glucose that it requires. And obviously, if someone is more active, they're going to have a higher overall protein demand irrespective. And so, if there's not going to be as much gluconeogenesis anyway, or if there is, it's because it's demanded. So either way, it's not really a problem.
Yeah. And also for the exercising person, like I'm pretty sure that the depletion of glycogen within the muscle and within the liver is if your exercise is going to far outweigh any gluconeogenesis that's taking place anyway. So, and that's really where people come unstuck, because then you get into this kind of sarcopenia and this kind of muscle wastage area. Then people lose power, they get weak, and then they don't like it, and they say, "Oh, all my high intensity is gone. I've got no strength." Like, well, yeah, of course. Like so yeah, I think they're the main things that I would think I've learned along the way, and definitely. And I eat a lot of protein now. I'd say big time on the protein. Not this week, but yeah, generally I'm very high on the protein.
When you, I don't just find you feel better, right? For a whole bunch of reasons, improved cognition and improved satiety and better auto-regulation, all those types of things. I mean, that they all result from that increased protein intake.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
That's what we see that a lot actually with people who have done extraordinarily well on low carb. And I'm thinking of a couple of specific cases that I've worked with. Pre-diabetic or diabetic, morbidly obese, having lost huge amounts of weight and done incredibly well, normalizing blood lipids, all the good stuff happening, but getting to a point where as they start to become more active, as most people do when they change their health status, they begin feeling worse because they're drastically limiting their protein. And they're so scared of protein, they're not prepared to increase it until you have a sit down with them and explain all these things that you've explained so eloquently.
Yeah.
And then they feel so much better.
Yeah. Well, yeah, hardly no surprise really, is it? But yeah. So yeah, but I think it's just something that's, unfortunately, it's something that's been driven into the low carb community. And it's just the same as people who are really sick and they need severe restriction, then maybe it's a thing. But someone who's just trying to shit a bit of substrate utilization and increase fat metabolism, then if you're exercising, you don't like. I'm in the course that I'm doing at the moment. I'm just writing a course about low carb performance for long distance triathlon. And I said, it's something you don't even have to consider. Don't even think about it. Just eat. Focus on the carbohydrates. Focus on those in grams. And then don't really worry too much about the protein at all, and just eat until you're satiated. And it's another thing that makes everything more simple, because if you're looking for longevity in this diet, you can't possibly be calculating all your proteins, be calculating all your carbohydrates all the time. So it just takes one thing off the table, then you just go, all I'm going to worry about is my carbohydrates. I'm not going to worry about how much fat. I'm not going to worry about how much protein. I'm just going to worry about my carbohydrates in the day. And then you're done. And then it's a lot easier for people to get to grips with.
Yeah. So in line with that, and I think you sort of suggested this before, there's some fluidity with the carb intake too, right? Because I know that a lot of, similar to protein, a lot of people who have been in the keto space or the low carb space have had these very arbitrary rules about, well, if you're keto, you're under 20 grams. And if you're low carb, you're under 50 grams. And if you're sort of moderate low carb, you're under 100 grams.
Yeah.
Which to me seems extraordinarily arbitrary, because you might have a calorie requirement based on your energy output of 2,000 calories versus 4,000 calories.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I guess that's where I think what I always suggest is that everyone should go through quite a low carb phase, like about a 3-week phase where they really push that keto stage, where I say is less than 50 grams per day. But then after that, that's the point where there's a little bit of what I think is like kind of finding your own personal sweet spot, and you're increasing that level to where you feel you perform best. And that can be anywhere from 50 to 130 grams. I've not really seen many people who benefit from going over 130 grams. But if you're a real pro guy who's training 30 hours a week, then you might want to increase it a bit more. But for most, 130 is kind of the upper level, I would say.
So if you have someone and they're slowly increasing their carbohydrate intake to try and optimize their performance, how do you measure that? Or is it purely qualitative? Is it subjective stuff, how they're feeling, how they feel they're going on the bike?
Yeah, I think it's mostly qualitative stuff. Obviously, like in this day and age, you can be quite quantitative with some of the power numbers and the running numbers and the heart rates. So, I mean, if I was working with someone, I'd just know just from some of the sessions that they do how easily they'll be hitting those kind of key sessions where they're hitting some more high end power. It doesn't really manifest very much in the lower end stuff, because people can still do that in any kind of way, but it does manifest a little bit in the higher end stuff. So, and also over time, like you just adapt to the diet, and you just seem to get better and better and better, better and better and better at the higher intensity, regardless of pushing up the carbohydrate intake. Someone who held their carbohydrate intake at a certain amount would likely get better over the number of years anyway. I mean, I certainly found that for me, from 2012 to 2018, it was kind of the gift that kept on giving, and I just progressively seemed to my recovery got better, or my high intensity got better, and everything just got better. And I didn't really change anything. It was just the natural course of the diet itself. So yeah, and I think if you remember the Volek Faster study, he kind of showed that himself, that the people who were chronically in it, they're really no different when they present at the start of the study in terms of muscle glycogen content and the rest. They're really no different to your high carb athlete anyway. So that research is suggestive of that for sure.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up, and I was really interested in your opinion on that longer term adaptation, whether you think some of the improvements that people get at their high end or high intensity bouts, whether that is predominantly a function of that improved, glycogen storage and glycogen repletion, which basically matches people who are on high carb diets, or whether there's a bit of a swing back where people begin to be able to be as efficient with their glucose utilization as someone who is on a higher carb diet, or do you think it's a combination of both?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I definitely think it's a little bit of the kind of like gluconeogenesis, and it's not just from protein in this stage. Gluconeogenesis can be from anywhere. So breaking down of a triglyceride molecule can produce some carbohydrates because it's glycerol is binding it, so which is kind of a carbohydrate. But also, I think what happens is that you do get the downregulation of certain enzymes. So it has been shown that you do get a downregulation of pyruvate dehydrogenase, so what's called PDH. But then people also are looking in the wrong place, because you might have a downregulation in one area and you have an upregulation in another area. So, there's probably the first thing is a downregulation, but with that downregulation, you might get an upregulation, and it's just that balancing of enzymes that's going to make that happen. There was a great editorial done by Dr. Tommy Woods in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning, he said it was something like about ketosis, and he basically said, "Are we looking in the wrong place?" And he gives a real nice summary as to why. Okay, yes, we do have a reduction in PDH, but on the other side, we've got upregulation of other enzymes that cause the high intensity efforts not to be downregulated. I think that's what's happening over time, is we're just finding other ways to do that high intensity work.
So is that sort of some mechanistic evidence that there is this gray area, and, as we're increasing the intensity of our exercise, we could potentially be tapping into a lot more glucose earlier, or if we're more fat adapted, we can sustain higher intensities, only to a point, of course, but sustain higher intensities on fatty oxidation?
Yeah, well, the thing is, we don't know. That is a question that no one has answered, and the reason no one's answered is almost possible without using some kind of radioactive isotope study. You can't. So typically in the lab, we'll measure fat and carbohydrate oxidation using a respiratory exchange ratio in the metabolic cart. So we look at expired VO2 and expired VCO2. But the problem with that is that because of the effect of acid and the buffering of acid, once we get to a higher intensity, it means VCO2 will go up by a large amount, which means it looks like the ratios go way out. So we're actually looking like we're producing, we're 150% carbohydrate, and which doesn't add up. So once we get pretty much past an RAR of 1, it's kind of off. And 1 is 100% carbohydrate, 0.7 being 100% fat. So at those submaximal intensities, we have a good idea of what's going on. But once we get above that, above 1, it kind of really goes off. So we don't know how much energy is coming from fat, even at high intensities, from fat adaptive athletes. It's a real good study that could be done if we use kind of radioactive isotope models, but the problem is that it's super expensive and not easy to do. So, and also that it becomes more complicated because we have internal bicarbonate stores within the muscle that kind of change. So it's really, really hard to do, which is why no one's done it yet. So yeah, that's the position we're in at the moment, unfortunately.
So I guess what we have at the moment is really just based on functional outcomes testing. And I know that's flawed because you're going to have a training stimulus typically between, baseline and outcome. But what do you think? I mean, if you had to create a hypothesis, would you say that there is this variability in that middle section where you can be using more or less carbohydrate, or do you think it's relatively fixed?
In what regard, in terms of high intensity, or?
So basically having that crossover zone where at consistently, slightly higher intensities, you can use more fat for fuel versus glucose, and there's a point at which you're basically only using glucose for fuel. Because some people think that there's basically just a cutoff, and above that, you're stuck, and that's genetically driven. But I certainly don't think that.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it's impossible to know. But I do believe that even at the higher intensities, there is a high contribution of fat, and we showed that. So me and Prof. Paul Lawson, we had a paper in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and we showed it was entitled "Rethinking Fat as a Fuel," and we showed that in the very highly trained individuals, it was looking at cross country skiers, and they did a very high intensity interval training, and it showed that even at the really high intensities, they still had a high contribution of fat as a fuel compared to a moderately trained person. And this was like, I can't remember, I think it was just above, such a long time since we wrote this paper, but it was just above VO2 max, VO2 max intensity, and they were still having high contributions of carbohydrates at that point. And that was done using RER, so respiratory exchange ratio, which likely underestimates the amount of fat that is used as a fuel, not overestimates it. So
interesting.
So I would say that definitely, yeah, there's a crossover point, of course, where you go to more predominantly fat versus to more predominantly carbohydrate from fat, and that is intensity driven. But where that point is higher than most people realize. It can be driven even higher with the correct diet, and yeah, we just don't know from the research that we want. And the likelihood is that the more fat adapted you are, the more highly trained you are, the higher that point is. So,
and am I correct in also thinking that it's location specific or tissue specific? Because if let's say your legs are really going for it, but you're a long distance runner, you're powering up a hill, there's not all as much, upper body movement as compared to, say, a 100-meter sprinter. Is that correct, that the different muscles working at different intensities would have different substrate usage?
Oh, well, if you think about where substrate use comes from and where that beta oxidation comes from, it's all derived from mitochondria, right? So the amount of mitochondria in the muscle. So if we look at the correlations between fat oxidation and VO2 max, for example, it's a very strong, like 0.8 to 0.9 correlation, because regardless, the fitter you are, the better your fat oxidation, which is because the fitter you are, the more mitochondria you have. So mitochondria being the powerhouse of the muscle cell. So yeah, like if you're using bigger muscle groups, you're going to have greater mitochondria turnover, and therefore there'll be more fat oxidation going on. We generally see that running has people running have higher fat maxes than people cycling, for example. So.
Of course, yeah.
So maybe there's something going on there because you're using your arms, you're not stationary, you're supporting your body weight. There's more postural things going on. There's more core stability going on, which is why we likely see a higher fat oxidation in runners and cyclists. So like many triathletes that I test, you'll test them on the bike, test them on the run, and their running fat oxidation can be 0.2 or 0.1 higher than what you see on the bike. But just to kind of, you mentioned it briefly before, is you mentioned, we have the training studies. So two training studies that I've been involved in. One's been published and one's about to be published it's currently under review in Frontiers in Physiology journal. So the first one was a shorter,
expensive journal.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having to pay for it. So the first one was an 8-week study that looked at, basically it took a group and put them on a low carb diet, and they underwent some high intensity interval training. And the high intensity interval training was set, I think 6 by 3 minutes at 110% of VO2 max. And it was a set, so that's kind of like the gold standard of that kind of interval. And it was basically, we looked at, if we put someone, this is a typical high intensity interval training session. If we put someone through a low carb diet, can they still do that type of session? Same power, same everything else. And they still could, totally fine. The only thing that happened was that the fat contribution during the high intensity intervals went up. Surprise, right? But they still did 110% of their VO2 max value, which is pretty high. And the more recent study that was currently under review in Frontiers was a 12-week ketogenic diet. It's probably one of the longest studies that I know of that's been in a ketogenic, well, I say ketogenic, more low carb diet. And what we did there is we did graded exercise tests, and we also did 30-15 tests. And for those who don't know what the 30-15 test is, pretty much like a shuttle test that's done a lot in team sports, a bit like the beep test or the yo-yo test. So it's a kind of a marker of aerobic fitness. So what we found is, and we also measured heart variability all the way through as well, which we can talk about in a bit. And what we found was after week 2, heart variability was down. Graded exercise test was worse. Step test was worse. But then progressively throughout the study, the low carb group got better and better and better and better. And eventually they were higher than by week 12, they were above in the 30-15 test and the graded exercise test, they were higher. And on an individual basis, we also saw that more people, nearly every person responded positively to the low carb diet through this training intervention. And in the high carb diet, some were positive and some were negative. So that's quite a cool new study, and hopefully be published. I think it's one of the longest 12-week low carb studies that's out there.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So what sort of carb intake were they on?
They were pretty low, less than 50 grams a day.
Oh wow, yeah, so that is low.
Yeah, and what was interesting is that ketones went up pretty high at the start and then came down, which is what I see all the time. And I think that's a major frustration, that people start the ketogenic diet and the ketones are quite high, and then gradually they just come back down to like normal levels almost. But they were still in that kind of low carb, less than 50 grams. So
I remember speaking with Steve Finney about that, because I had noticed that clinically over many years there was this sort of increase and then a bit of a drop, plateau, and then sometimes people got a bump many months later again. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but my simplistic sort of understanding, or my simplistic hypothesis, I guess, not understanding, but my simplistic hypothesis was that people just become a bit more efficient at utilizing ketones.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's 100% the reason, because what we're measuring in ketones and beta hydroxybutyrate, when we measure it in the blood, we're just measuring its appearance, right? Rate of appearance. We're not measuring its usage. So the reason that it's so high when people first start out on the diet is because your body's like, what the hell are these ketones? I don't know what to do with these things, but gradually, you become better and better at using them. And then their appearance is less. It doesn't mean that their production is any lower. In fact, their production could be higher. We just don't know. It's just that it's exactly the same as when we measure lactate. So in the lab, we might measure lactate in the blood during an incremental exercise test. We're only measuring its rate of appearance. So the really fit individuals, they might be producing as much lactate, but their rate of appearance is less because they've got so much aerobic muscle that they're just soaking up that lactate, converting it back to pyruvate, and then running it back through aerobic metabolism, using it again. So it's exactly the same principle.
So with respect to ketone levels, do you think that there are any tipping points, or do you think that there's any benefit in being higher versus just basically being wherever you are, based on eating a good diet and making sure you're well fueled?
No, I think it's very individual. As a 100% sit on the fence answer. But I think I don't really think there are any optimal levels. Even like the Volek and Finney, their guidelines, like to be in ketosis, you're above 0.5. I don't know whether that's even necessarily true. I measure my ketones quite a lot. Like today, I was sat this morning after a bike ride at 0.8. And I'll seldom see anything over 1.
As far as I know, and I spoke with Steve Finney about this. As far as I know, he said that they didn't base that on any evidence. Yeah,
that would make sense because like at the moment, as I mentioned before we started, I'm doing this fasting mimicking diet, so my calories are low and everything's really, really low. So obviously I am in some ketosis, but I think like it's more of an interest to know, can you produce them when you need to? That's what you really need to know. So if you're doing a long bike ride and you're coming in and you're dizzy, you're bonked, you're all over the place, what's your blood glucose? What's your ketones? Because I can guarantee you that you're likely the person who has just got a blood glucose down in the low threes and a ketone down at 0.2 or 0.1, right? And that's when you're in trouble. Because you've got to think about it as what I like to think about is overall substrate. So if your blood glucose is down at 3.8, but you've got a 0.8 ketone, you're absolutely living life. But if you're that person who's got a 3.7 or 3.8 blood glucose and a 0.1 ketone, you're in trouble. And that's what I'd be interested in, because you're obviously not, you're not going to beta oxidation, you're not using fatty acids as a fuel, and you're not breaking down ketones for the brain. So something's missing in your metabolic machinery at that point.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think when people are chasing ketones, it can be a little bit limiting. It can also be limiting on the wallet, but
because those strips are not cheap.
Well, and neither are ketone supplements, as you well know. So I often ask people when they're chasing higher and higher levels, they're looking for 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s.
Crazy, absolutely crazy. I would never see a number like that. Even after I did like a long ride, I might be 1.1, 1.2, but like I would if I'm in my normal diet, I would never ever be in ketosis in the morning. Never ever. Maybe after I've done a bit of exercise, but then I would be in ketosis. If I went, just had a kind of a fat black coffee and did a bike and a run or something, I'd then be in ketosis, but not in the morning. No.
I would find if I was eating a lot of carbohydrate, let's say up to even up to 200 grams, but I was carb backloading that and then doing a little bit of intermittent fasting, eating practically no carbs, apart from obviously vegetables and things the rest of the day, I'd find that I would begin hitting 0.6, 0.7 around lunchtime.
Right, okay.
But that's basically it.
Yeah.
But even if I'm not eating any carbohydrate whatsoever, I would seldom get over about 1.4.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So, for this week, for example, the highest I've read is 0.8. And so to give it a bit of perspective, on Monday I had 15 grams of, less than 50 grams of carbs a day, 15 grams of protein a day, and the rest is fat. Right? And so day one, I was 1,100 calories. Yesterday, I was 750 calories. Today, I will be 800 calories. And then tomorrow, and I've got 2 more days to go. But on top of that, I cycled 600 calories on Monday. I ran 400 calories on Tuesday, and I biked 1,200 calories today. So you imagine my calorie deficit, right? As I sit here right now, but I'm pretty. At least I hope I'm talking okay. I'm not looking too fuzzy. So yeah, but it's amazing what you can do. But it's also amazing that my ketones still haven't gone that high. You would expect that they would be a lot higher than that, but I think it's because I'm so fat adapted. I've been doing it for so long that I'm just eating.
You're using them, right?
Yeah.
That's one thing that, again, I spoke with Stephanie about a couple of years back, was that little bump that we sometimes see. And what often was associated with that was, most people, as you've seen as well, when they start a keto diet, if they're fasting, after fasting, so in the morning or during or after exercise, their ketone levels are higher. But what I've often seen is when people have been on a keto diet for a long time, their ketone levels in the morning are lower, and their ketone levels after exercise are lower than habitual. Now, they might be slightly higher than the person who's just getting into ketosis, but I would say that's just purely from using them. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And I think, and I find, I see in the data all the time when people first start, they report crazy high numbers, and just gradually it goes down over time. And that was exactly what we saw in our 12-week research that we did. So
I also think people get more sensible and they start eating more vegetables and more protein as well.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Realize
which helps.
Maintainable.
Yeah. Hey, so you mentioned HRV a little while back, and we didn't get on to talking about that last time. Now, I've become more interested in HRV the last year or so, and I've been listening to a few podcasts and things, and it seems like a lot of people mischaracterize what HRV even is. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and he was saying, well, you wake up and you take your heart rate, and if it's higher, it means this, and if it's lower, it means that. But that's completely not what it is, right?
Well, if you get a mix up between heart rate and heart rate variability, then yeah,
Exactly.
there is a bit of a difference. So heart rate is basically how many times your heart beats in a minute, whereas heart rate variability is looking at the variation in the gap between heartbeats over a time section, which could be 5 minutes, could be a minute, could be whatever you want it to be. So why we're interested in that is that that variation. So even if we're sat here now, say we're sat here on a heart rate 60, it doesn't mean that gap between each beat is 1 second. It's varying all the time. And the reason we're interested in that is because it's linked to the autonomic nervous system. So two sides of the autonomic nervous system, one side being the sympathetic side, so kind of your stress or fight or flight side. So if you're stressed at work, you're exercising, or you get a fright, you will have activation of the sympathetic side. Conversely, on the other side, you've got the parasympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system, which is more your rest and digest. So you and me sat here now, pretty chilled out, we're quite relaxed, we'll be predominantly parasympathetic. And these two, they kind of work in conjunction with one another. Like if you'll have a parasympathetic withdrawal before you have a sympathetic activation. So to increase heart rate, for example, heart rate will first increase by parasympathetic withdrawal. So parasympathetic activity slows down the heart, and then so if you withdraw it, heart rate will increase. And then once you get to a certain point, sympathetic activation increases the heart rate to make it go to really high levels. And what's associated with that is so more variation in heart rate variability. So the more variation between beats is more parasympathetic, and less variation between beats is more sympathetic.
And so how does that apply to athletes? Like how can they use HRV, or what functional benefit does it have to be measuring that for an athlete?
So you can measure it now. So I remember when I first started doing my PhD in this area, it was a bit of a pain in the backside. You had to do it for 5 minutes. You had to put on a strap in the morning, a heart rate polar strap, and measure it for 5 minutes. But now we're at this position where we can just measure it through an iPhone. You can use an app called HRV for training, where you can use the finger on the back of the camera, really easy, taken in 1 minute, super simple. But where it's really good is because if you think about the sympathetic side being more stress, the parasympathetic side being more recovery and rest and digest, you can kind of get a good proxy measure of how you're coping with a given training load, whether you're adapting positively or you're adapting negatively. So what we usually see is that someone's adapting positively to a given training load, HRV will increase. And then if they're adapting negatively to a training load, that HRV will gradually decrease over time. So that's how most people use it in an athlete setting. And
that app you mentioned that's been validated, right? There's been some research on that. Did you do that research?
Yeah, I did that research. Yeah, so I was published in the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance. I was the lead author on that, and we compared HRV for training to ECG. So ECG is pretty much the gold standard of HRV. And we also put the polar heart rate monitor in there as well, and it was a very close relationship to pretty much 0.98. So you don't get much closer than that. So to what the ECG is. I think where most people get unstuck with HRV is that you could sit here now and you could take it 1 minute and take it a minute later, and it would be different. But this is the thing: it's our internal physiology and our autonomic nervous system is constantly changing. So it's all about understanding what is a big change, and it's understanding kind of that signal to noise ratio. So HRV it can be noisy in terms of physiology. It's not noisy in terms of the technical area of measurement, but it can be noisy in terms of the physiology of it being forever changing. On the other side, the signal is also quite large, so we can see big changes, and it's more responsive to changes in stress, more responsive to changes in training load than something like resting heart rate, for example, which is likely less noise but lower signal. So that's kind of where HRV has real benefits, because it's very sensitive to change.
So the simplified metrics that they use, for example, in HRV for training, it gives you your recovery points. Does that, and it's got a range, so it sort of gives you indications. Is that a pretty good measure there, or do you think you need to dive deeper into it?
So the range that is given in HRV for training, for example, that range is your own range. It's based on your baseline value, so it won't give you that until you've done a number of days of the training. And it's pretty much, it's based on your average value and your day-to-day variation, and it's basically a CV of your normal value. So if you're a person who naturally varies a lot in the day, from day to day, you will have a much wider band before you'll get a flag. Whereas if you're someone who doesn't actually vary that much, your band will be narrower, because smaller change is more meaningful. The HRV for training app, though, that's given on a day-to-day basis. I'm not really a fan of looking at HRV acutely. I look at it more chronically, so I'll look at rolling averages. So HRV for training also have it's called the HRV Pro app, and it's actually on the desktop, and I use that with my athletes. I have all of them stacked in a line, and I can see them all in one go, and that uses kind of more rolling averages, which I find more useful than the day-to-day stuff. So I don't really look at the day-to-day.
And well, there's been some debate around the utility of HRV for non-endurance athletes, so your strength and power athletes. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just not really something that's researched. And there's a guy called Andrew Flatt from the University of Alabama, and he's done a lot in the area of more strength. I think there is some take homes, because people don't realize that it's not just a marker of training, it's a marker of life, it's a marker of overall stress. So it can pick up other things as well. But any degree of muscular acidosis, so any kind of so say you're doing if you're doing reps in the gym that are low reps, high strength, probably not so much. But if you're doing something more like your CrossFit, for example, definitely would pick something like that up. So if you're doing high reps, high reps where you're producing, it's kind of more anaerobic, that would show in your HRV for sure.
I've found, and this might just be coincidental, I'm not sure, but I've found it's quite interesting that, because I've been taking it for quite a while now, when it indicates that I'm a bit more fatigued or whatever it happens to be, that would be obviously HRV being lower, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel pretty good, and there's been a number of occasions where I felt pretty good, and I've thought, oh well, it's obviously just an aberration. But I've got into the gym and really haven't performed as well. Conversely, there's been times when HRV's been higher and it looks like it's all sort of trending up, but I feel kind of a bit shit, maybe just a slight, few hours less sleep, or maybe you had a beer the night before or whatever. But I get into the gym, and once I click into it, I basically kill it.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any rationale for that, or do you think that that's just an experiential thing and it's just coincidence?
Well, I mean, what you just reported, it does make sense. I mean, the one thing we know is we're not always that in tune with how we really going, and the HRV being higher, we do see that a lot. So lots of the training studies, what we find is that when HRV is high, often you don't actually feel good, but you can still execute sessions. So the sign of someone coping well with a high training load is HRV is going up. So people are getting higher and higher in the HRV. They feel tired. They feel like they're not, they generally report badly, but once they get into the training session, they are pretty good. They're just basically holding the same levels as they would always do. But then once the taper and it comes off a bit, HRV will go back down to kind of more of a baseline level, and then the performance will have an increase. So yeah, it's not uncommon to have that kind of mixed high HRV feeling bad but still going okay. That's been done it's been reported quite a lot. I reported it in Journal of Sports Medicine with some rowers. Jan Lemore reported it in some triathletes, and another author, Clint Bellinger, he reported it as well in some other triathletes, and we've all kind of shown that same thing. So, yeah.
And have you got any research going on at the moment in HRV?
No, I'm not actually. I'm kind of nothing in the world of HRV. I probably should, but yeah, maybe.
But it's certainly something that you use with your athletes and
Oh
monitor
yeah,
that.
I mean, I'm still well into the HRV. I'm just not doing any active research at the moment in the area. I guess I am collaborating with a group in Spain we're doing some stuff in the heart rate variability. So we just had they had one study published that was daily training prescription based on heart rate variability. So this one study that's now under review was block periodization, general block periodization versus HRV guided training. So they've been pretty encouraging. Generally, people respond more positively when training is guided by heart rate variability in the morning. So you kind of wait until you get that reading, and then if it's a high reading, you do high intensity training. If it's a low reading, you do low intensity training. That was kind of where HRV first started, where the interest, because people think we prescribe training based on that. So yeah, and that's been quite encouraging. And then we're kind of looking at another area now where we're trying to find relationships between a female cyclist and HRV over different power outputs. So yeah, a few things in that area.
Interesting. Yeah, I was talking with Eric Helms. Do you know Eric?
Not well. I obviously know of him because of his massive social media following.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to talk to him about whether he thought there was any application for HRV in a podcast we did a couple of weeks back, in Strength and Power, this is. And I didn't get around to asking him it because he had already done a little article in his mass research review about HRV for, say, bodybuilding, strength and power. Didn't really have any strong conclusions there, but certainly thought that it was an interesting area of research. And obviously with his PhD having been in auto-regulation of training using, perceived exertion scales and things, there could be quite a nice little marriage there. So I'm certainly watching this space because I think it's fascinating, and I'm using it with my athletes a fair bit now. Yeah,
it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll have a chat with him. I'll flick him a note and see if he can think of anything. I mean, I'd love to do a little bit in bodybuilding and strength and the HRV space, because I think it's something that's not really understood, and I think I've kind of done the endurance thing, and I don't know about you. I'm looking for. I don't know how you. Sometimes I'm doing this course at the moment with low carb diet, and I'm kind of looking forward to kind of moving on from that and doing something else, because it's just such a contentious area, and I'm like, God, it gets tiring, So
yeah, and it's hard to be pragmatic in that space. I think you're one of the more pragmatic people out there because you recognize the utility of carbohydrate and the spectrum of carb intake, but there's so many people out there who are so dogmatic either way. It's very difficult to define a middle ground.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because I had a chat with someone the other day, like, my background is I'm not a nutritionist. I'm a physiologist. My main background is training and, all the stuff we talked about, the lactates and training intensities and all that. It's not really nutrition, but I've just kind of got into this area from my own personal bit of research and my own personal journey, right? So, it's funny because in the course that we're producing, we've got one section that's in the female athlete, and most of the course it's a bit practical. It's a little bit academic, but mostly it's my own practical application of how I have done it personally. So it's apart from the female module, which is really quite purely research and academic because I've no experience in that area. So yeah.
So with the course you're running, is this geared more towards the athlete or the coach or both?
It's geared towards both. And geared towards long distance triathletes. But so the idea is that you as a coach or an athlete, you could take on the information and do it yourself, and also you could take on the information and guide someone else into doing it as well. So it's got both really. It's got like troubleshooting things and all that kind of thing. So yeah, it's been. I mean, like, we've been astounded at how popular it is as well. Like, we sold out the first, so we did a soft launch of like up to, for just 40 people a couple of weeks ago, and it sold out in 3 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah, so pretty good, not bad.
I might have to get out of the education game and just leave it to you, mate.
Yeah, well, I'll stick to the long distance triathlon. So yeah.
Well, that's great, right? With the growth of this area and the segmentation, that's one thing that really excites me. Is you've got people like yourself, and you're working with, you know, endurance athletes and probably a bit of crossover there as well, and really getting some good information out. Obviously, my client base would be completely different to yours, but it means that there's really good information going out that is very tailored to what people need, rather than before. I think a lot of it was very generic, homogenized stuff, and it didn't really work particularly well because it wasn't specific.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's the devil is in the detail in this sort of thing completely. And to have the detail, you have to have the context. And without those two things together, you may as well not even bother trying. So yeah, that's the way.
And I think it's really important to have done it. I mean, I think that's why, you know, you're such a powerful educator, because you've researched it, you've studied it, but you've lived it as well. And not just in a lifestyle setting, but from lifestyle through to performance. And that's fairly unrivaled. I don't think there's many people who can really claim that.
Yeah, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of anyone else, to be honest with you. So, I mean, yeah, I guess that's kind of where that's certainly the position that I'm taking on all of Endure IQ, really. And I mean, what we're trying to build is we really want to build a community of long distance triathletes who just want to learn from each other and kind of get all that and not have to trawl the internet for false information all the time, and have just a resource that's tested and true, and people can feel free to communicate in a friendly manner with one another about all kinds of different things. And the first one will be low carb, and then we'll look to do some more on training and hydration and sodium and whatever that might be.
Awesome. One thing I meant to ask you earlier on was what sort of role does strength training play in your own preparation for events? Well,
it's a good question, because I've probably done more strength training since finishing Kona than I have done in my whole life. So to be honest with you, not a lot, really. I've never been big on the strength, but I have been big on the strength within sessions. So like, I'll do a lot of paddle work in the gym, do a lot of hill work running, and hill work on the bike. And I've always been pretty good at that. And I always thought I was reasonably strong, because I was always a good hill climber on the bike. I was always good at running up hills. I did, in the build up to Kona, I would do some more core mobility and postural work, but it certainly wasn't strength work related. So yeah, not a lot. But since finishing Kona, I've been getting into it a little bit more. And mainly the reason is that because I've just worked now as head of performance for Emirates Team New Zealand. So so that's what I'm doing as well at the moment. So, and working with the grinders, seeing them in the gym, I'm like, took this realization of just exactly how weak I actually am, compared to guys like that. And it's kind of scared me a little bit, like, because I'm 36 now, and the only thing that's going to happen from now is I'm just going to get weaker unless I do something about it. So yeah, I've been making more of a conscious effort to get into the gym, and I've got this aim of, literally, I could literally do 2 chin-ups and that'd be me. So I'm trying to get to a point where I'm a bit stronger and a bit more able, and I'm actually quite enjoying it. But my body does not like adapting to that kind of thing. It's like a very slow process. Like, you give me some endurance training and I'll soak it up immediately, but the strength stuff is just like so slow, and I find it like, and I just don't get the same buzz that I do from endurance training. Like, so I do
such a personality thing, eh?
Yeah, I do a session in the gym, and I'm like, what was the point in that? But
See, I'm exactly the same about going out and running.
Yeah, yeah.
Why would I do that? I'd rather go in the gym and pick up something really freaking heavy.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Pick it up once and that's it.
yeah, there you go. So what I tend to do is I'll for my gym, I'll run 7 or 8K first, and then I'll go in the gym for 30 minutes or so and do like full body. I do like a full body circuit. So, and my colleague at Emirates Team New Zealand, a guy called Adam Story, who's
I know Adam well. We used to live together.
oh, there you go. So yeah. So Adam puts me through the ropes. He shows me a few tricks to get me going. So that's pretty good. Yeah.
I'll have to get Adam on actually, because he's, I think when we were training together, we are both training at North Sport for weightlifting.
Yeah, okay.
And I think he was still doing his undergrad at the time.
Yeah, well, he's
obviously he's gone on to do great things.
Adam was like super smart guy, very smart guy, one of the smartest guys I know for sure, especially like in that kind of, in just the adaptation and the gene expression and all that kind of space. So I would definitely recommend you get him on your show. And also, he's finally seen the light and he's gone into doing a bit of like long distance running now. So he's, he's on my team now.
I think from memory, he was always pretty well put together, pretty fit. But
I don't know. I don't know if you've seen him recently, but he's not the power lifter. He's still got a bit of muscle on him, but he's certainly not the power lifter that he used to be. Like he's lost a lot of weight. He's like 75 kilograms now. I think he was maybe 15 kgs heavier than that. So, but he's still strong, right? He can still do, which is cool. So yeah. So my aim is to get a little bit stronger. I had this aim. I was saying to my wife that I want to do every year. I want to do for 2020, the start of the new year. I want to do 20 chins in the 20K run. 2021, 21 chins in the 21K run. 2022, 22 chins in the 22.
Wow. That's a good goal, because people think about that as not being that extraordinary, but doing over 20 chin-ups is freaking.
Well, put it this way, the run doesn't scare me.
Yeah, exactly.
But 22 chins?
I'm the exact opposite. That run scares the shit out of me. 22
chins is a long way to go from what I can do at the moment. So that's kind of the my mini little goal. But I think that would be quite cool to be able to do that, because to me, like the chin-up's a good indicator of just general strength. So.
Yeah. So any sort of parting advice you'd give to an endurance athlete who's wanting to start experimenting with fat adaptation or lower carb nutrition?
Oh, well, I guess my first advice would be to sign up and do our course.
Good. And tell us the how to spell that Endure IQ as well, just so people get it right.
Endurance, so ENDURE.
Yep.
IQ.com.
Perfect. We'll put that in the show notes as well, obviously.
Yeah, and we've got a few blogs up there, and you can we kind of teach you the why, is trying to convince people why it is a thing. We model a few races. I think that would be the main, and I think don't listen to what you read on the internet, and don't follow these general guidelines that are not tailored for long distance triathlon, because, like, as I say, the devil is in the detail, and the devil is in the detail is all around the context of what you're trying to do. So if you're just a office worker, completely different to a triathlete, and if you're an office worker who's not very well, completely different to an office worker who's really healthy. So I think do the research into what it means to be a low carb athlete for your particular sport, and again, differing people, like different sports will have different requirements. So I think, and that's where people get upset about things. You talk about low carb nutrition, it's almost like it's a religion sometimes, the way people get upset about it. But I think it's people disagree because everything's about context, and no one can talk freely unless you're talking within a specific context. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, with the growth of low carb, there's a lot of people who have been in it for some time and are seen as being, almost gurus in the space, but their time on feet in the industry is actually pretty slim,
Mm-hmm.
There's, I was reading a bio of, I won't say who, but a a fairly well-known keto coach, and he's sort of saying that he helped introduce this whole thing to the mainstream and whatnot, and he started doing this back in 2005. You know, about 2015, right? So 4 or 5 years ago, get into this area. And while that's a fairly long time to be focusing on a specific thing, you and I will both know that, I guess, in our times in practice, you develop pragmatism over a long time. You know, I tried my first ketogenic diet when I was a high school athlete back in 1996.
Yeah, wow, that's ages.
And then gave my first ketogenic nutrition plan to a client in 1998.
Yeah.
So a long time ago, and you can only become more pragmatic with time, I think. You lose that new convert zealotry.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
And so I think what you said before about getting advice, you know, so if people want to get into endurance nutrition, they want to look at fat adaptation, lower carb, whatever, and going to your site and getting some coaching on there, I think the value of that cannot be overstated. You know, a lot of my work at the moment is troubleshooting for people who have developed all this confusion from searching Dr. Google.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's great for me as a business, but I'd rather not be having to deal with all of that.
And this is the problem, right? And I think, like, you know, our course is like $299 USD, so it's not even expensive, right? It's and for, you know,
very well priced.
Yeah, it's a cost of a pair of trainers, and it's not, and we're just trying to make a difference, really, and educate people in the right way. We're not looking to make millions and millions, you know, but I think, you know, if you look at that, you can, in terms of the time saving that you can have in your time researching it, and also on the race course itself, it's quite huge. So,
absolutely.
Well worth it.
Yeah. Well, Dan Plews, it's always fascinating talking with you.
No, pleasure.
I'm going to have to get you back on again, because there's always things that we don't get around to discussing. But yeah, just doing absolutely great work, and I'd encourage everyone to go to Enduro IQ. We'll obviously have the information and the links up on our show notes, so check those out. But yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks for being on yet again.
Till next time. Thanks, Cliff. Thank you.
Indeed. Thanks, buddy.
Bye-bye.